The earth beneath my foxhole trembled like the devil himself was clawing up from hell. I pressed my face into the mud of Henderson Field as another 150mm howitzer shell screamed overhead, close enough that I could feel the heat of its passage. The explosion behind me lit up the jungle like a photographer's flash, and in that split second of hellish illumination, I saw them, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging through the wire, their bayonets gleaming, their battle cries cutting through the thunder of artillery like banshees in the night. My name is John Basilone, Gunnery Sergeant, 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, and this is the story of how 38 Marines held a ridge that saved Guadalcanal and maybe the whole Pacific War. 3 days earlier, October 22nd, the rain had finally stopped. For 6 weeks, we'd been fighting two enemies on this godforsaken island, the Japanese and the jungle itself. The mud was everywhere in our weapons, our food, our souls. It clung to us like guilt, and the smell of it mixed with cordite and death had become the perfume of our existence. I was sitting in my command post, cleaning my Colt, 45 for the 100th time that week, when Colonel Lewis Chesty walked up. Even in this green hell, Chesty looked like he'd stepped off a recruiting poster. Square jaw, steely eyes, and that cocky grin that said he'd rather be fighting than breathing. "Johnny," he said, using the nickname that only he and my mother were allowed to use. "Intelligence says the Japs are massing for a big push. Could be tonight, could be tomorrow. They're calling it their decisive battle." I looked up from my pistol. "How big we talking, Colonel?" 20,000 men. Maybe more. General Maruyama's entire 2nd Division, plus elements of the 38th Infantry Brigade. Poor squatted down beside me, his voice dropping to that gravelly whisper he used when things were about to get real ugly. "They're coming right up the Lunga Ridge, Johnny. Right at your position." My position. Machine gun section, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. 38 men and 4 Browning M1917 water-cooled machine guns, holding a 1,000-yard front that stretched from the Lunga River to the edge of Fighter 1 airstrip. If the Japanese broke through here, they'd roll right up Henderson Field and push us into the sea. "What's our support looking like?" I asked. "The 164th Infantry Regiment landed yesterday, Army boys, fresh from the States. They're green but eager. Artillery's got plenty of ammo, and if we can hold until dawn, we'll have air support." Poor stood up, brushing mud off his knees. "The thing is, Johnny, we can't lose that airfield. Without Henderson Field, we lose Guadalcanal. Without Guadalcanal." He didn't need to finish. We all knew what was at stake. This wasn't just another Pacific island. This was the hinge of the war. If we lost here, the Japanese would have a clear path to Australia and New Zealand. The entire balance of power in the Pacific hung on whether 38 Marines could hold a ridge in the middle of nowhere. That night, I walked the line, checking on my boys. Most of them were kids, 18, 19 years old, from places like Iowa and Texas and Brooklyn. They joined the Corps thinking they'd see adventure, maybe get some stories to tell their grandchildren. Now they were digging foxholes in a jungle that wanted to kill them, preparing to face an enemy that would rather die than surrender. Private Robert Powell, a farm boy from Kansas, was nervously checking his ammunition for the dozenth time. "Sarge," he said, "you really think they're coming tonight?" I knelt beside his foxhole, keeping my voice calm and steady. "They might, son. If they do, just remember your training. Keep your sectors of fire clear, conserve your ammo, and trust the man next to you. We've been through worse." That last part was a lie. We hadn't been through worse. Nothing any of us had experienced. Not the landing on August 7th, not the fight for the airfield, not even the naval battles that lit up Iron Bottom Sound like the 4th of July. Nothing compared to what was coming. At 2,100 hours, the first artillery rounds began falling on Henderson Field. Japanese 150mm howitzers, firing from positions in the hills south of the airfield. The shells came in groups of 4 or 5, methodical and precise, walking their way across our positions like a deadly metronome. I was in my command bunker with my radio operator, Corporal Steve Evanson, listening to the reports coming in from forward observers. The Japanese weren't just probing. This was the real thing. "Basilone, this is topside," came Chesty Puller's voice over the radio. "We're getting reports of large formations moving up the Lunga Ridge. Estimate battalion strength, maybe more. They'll hit you first. Roger, topside. We're ready." But nobody is ever really ready for what war throws at you. The artillery barrage intensified around midnight. Shells were falling every 15 seconds now, a steady drumbeat that made the earth shake and my teeth rattle. Between explosions, I could hear something else, the sound of hundreds of men moving through the jungle, speaking in hushed Japanese voices, the clink of equipment and the soft squelch of boots and mud. I moved from position to position, making sure my machine gunners were ready. The Browning M1917s were the backbone of our defense, water-cooled, belt-fed monsters that could fire 500 rounds per minute and cut down anything that moved. I had 2 guns positioned to cover the main approach up the ridge, with overlapping fields of fire. The other 2 were positioned to cover the flanks. At 0200 hours, the artillery stopped. The silence was worse than the shelling. In that terrible quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, the nervous breathing of the Marines around me, and somewhere out in the darkness, the sound of safety catches clicking off thousands of Arisaka rifles. "Here they come," I whispered into my radio. The attack began with a scream that seemed to come from the earth itself. Thousands of Japanese voices raised in their battle cry, "Banzai! Ten no hei ka banzai! Long live the Emperor!" They came out of the jungle like a human tidal wave, their bayonets fixed, their faces painted with mud and determination. I was behind the leftmost machine gun, operated by Private Powell and Private Allen. The Japanese were barely visible in the darkness, just shapes moving through the undergrowth, but I could see the glint of steel and the occasional muzzle flash from their rifles. "Wait for it," I told Powell. "Let them get close." They came closer. 50 yards. 30 yards. I could see individual faces now, twisted with rage and fear and fanatical devotion. These weren't the same Japanese soldiers we'd fought earlier in the campaign. These men were different. Harder. More desperate. "Now," I shouted. "Open fire." The machine guns erupted in perfect synchronization, their muzzle flashes lighting up the night like strobe lights. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that drowned out everything else, even the screams of dying men. The first wave of Japanese soldiers went down like wheat before a scythe. Bodies piled up in front of our positions, but more kept coming. They climbed over their own dead, firing as they advanced, their bullets whining past me head like angry hornets. Powell's gun jammed after the first belt. I could see him frantically working the action, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night air. "I can't get it cleared, Sarge," he shouted over the noise. I grabbed my M1 Gar and jumped into his foxhole. "Keep working on it," I yelled, then began firing at the advancing Japanese. The Garand's 8-round clip emptied quickly, and I slammed in another, then another. Around me, the other Marines were firing as fast as they could, but there were so many Japanese soldiers that individual shots didn't seem to matter. A grenade landed 5 yards to my right. I threw myself on top of Powell just as it exploded, feeling shrapnel tear through the sandbags above us. When I looked up, 3 Japanese soldiers were charging directly at our position, their bayonets leveled. I put 2 rounds into the first man's chest, watched him spin and fall. The second soldier stumbled over his body, and I shot him in the head. The third was almost on top of us when Powell got his machine gun working again. The burst of 30 caliber bullets literally cut the man in half. "That's it, Powell," I shouted. "Keep them coming." For the next hour, it was pure hell. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers attacked our positions, and we cut them down with methodical precision. The machine guns overheated and had to be cooled with water from our canteens. When we ran out of water, some of the Marines urinated on the barrels to keep them from seizing up. I moved from position to position, carrying ammunition, clearing jammed weapons, and encouraging my men. The Japanese never stopped coming. Every time I thought we'd broken their attack, another group would emerge from the jungle, screaming their battle cries and charging into our fire. At 0400 hours, my radio crackled to life. It was Colonel Cor. Basilone, what's your status? Still holding, sir, but we're running low on ammunition. I estimate we've killed 300, maybe 400 enemy, but they keep coming. Help is on the way, Johnny. Just hold on a little longer. A little longer. In combat, time moves differently. Minutes feel like hours, hours feel like days. Every second was an eternity of muzzle flashes and screams and the wet sound of bullets hitting human flesh. At 0430, the Japanese launched their biggest attack yet. This time, they came from 3 directions simultaneously, up the ridge, along the river, and through a gap in our lines that they'd been probing all night. For a moment, I thought we were finished. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I grabbed 2 ammunition belts, slung them over my shoulders, and ran to the machine gun position that was taking the heaviest pressure. The gun crew was down to 1 man, Corporal Evanson, and he was wounded, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. I got this, Steve, I said, pushing him aside and taking control of the gun. What happened next is burned into my memory like a brand. I fired that machine gun for what felt like an hour, sweeping it back and forth across the advancing Japanese like I was watering a garden. The barrel glowed cherry red in the darkness. Empty cartridge cases piled up around my feet like brass snow. When he ran out of ammunition for that gun, I grabbed a second machine gun that had been abandoned when its crew was killed. Then a third. I was moving from position to position, firing until the guns overheated, then moving to the next one. At some point during that long night, I ran completely out of machine gun ammunition. But the Japanese were still coming, closer now, some of them making it to within 10 yards of our positions before we could stop them. I picked up my M1 Gar and began working as a sniper, picking off Japanese officers and machine gunners. When I ran out of rifle ammunition, I drew my .45 pistol. When that was empty, I picked up a discarded Japanese rifle and used Thyron bullets against them. Somewhere around 0530 hours, as dawn began to break over Guadalcanal, the attacks finally stopped. The jungle fell silent except for the moans of wounded men and the crackling of fires started by tracer bullets. I looked around at what we had accomplished, and I honestly couldn't believe it. The ground in front of our positions was carpeted with Japanese dead. Bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in some places, a testament to the fanatical bravery of men who charged into certain death because their emperor commanded it. As the sun came up on October 26, 1942, the full scope of what had happened began to become clear. Intelligence reports would later confirm that we had faced elements of 3 Japanese regiments, approximately 3,000 men. Of those, nearly 1,500 were killed in front of our positions. The survivors had retreated back into the jungle, carrying their wounded and abandoning their attack on Henderson Field. My machine gun section had held 38 Marines against 3,000 Japanese soldiers, and we had held. But the cost was terrible. Of my original 38 men, only 18 were still able to fight. The rest were dead or wounded, victims of an enemy that fought with a savage intensity I had never experienced before or since. Private Powell didn't make it. A Japanese sniper got him just after dawn, as he was helping to collect ammunition from the battlefield. He died holding the machine gun that had saved all our lives, a farm boy from Kansas who had become a Marine when his country needed him most. Corporal Evanson survived, though he lost the sight in his left eye from shrapnel. He would later tell reporters that I had fought like a one-man army, though I've never seen it that way. I was just doing my job, the same as every other Marine on that ridge. The Japanese dead told their own story. These weren't the poorly equipped, half-starved soldiers we had faced earlier in the campaign. These men carried good weapons, had plenty of ammunition, and fought with the disciplined ferocity of elite troops. They had come to Guadalcanal prepared to die, and many of them had gotten their wish. Among the dead, we found the body of Colonel Hiroshi of the Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment. His personal effects included detailed maps of Henderson Field and orders calling for the complete destruction of the American airfield and the annihilation of all enemy forces on Guadalcanal. They had come so close to succeeding that it still gives me nightmares. 3 days later, I was called to Colonel Puller's headquarters. I expected a debriefing, maybe a commendation for the section. Instead, I found a group of war correspondents waiting to interview me, and Colonel Puller with a wide grin on his weathered face. "Johnny," he said, "I've got some news. You're going home." Home. The word seemed foreign after 4 months in the jungle. "Sir, you've been awarded the Medal of Honor, son. Congressional Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy. You're going back to the States for the presentation ceremony. Then you're going on a war bond tour." I stared at him, not understanding. "Sir, my men, your men will be taken care of. But right now, the country needs a hero, Johnny. They need to know that American Marines are winning this war, one ridge at a time. The Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor that our nation can bestow." I thought about Private Powell, about Corporal Evanson, and all the other Marines who had fought and bled and died on that ridge. I thought about the Japanese soldiers who had charged into our fire with nothing but rifles and bayonets and an unshakable belief in their cause. "I don't feel like a hero, sir," I said quietly. Colonel Puller's expression grew serious. "None of us do, son. That's what makes us heroes." I left Guadalcanal on November 12, 1942, aboard a transport ship bound for San Francisco. As the island disappeared behind me, I could still see the smoke rising from Henderson Field, still hear the sound of Marine corsairs taking off to bomb Japanese positions in the hills. The medal ceremony took place at the White House on May 21, 1943. President Roosevelt himself pinned the Medal of Honor on my chest, and I shook hands with politicians and generals and reporters who wanted to hear the story of how 38 Marines held a ridge against impossible odds. But I never told them the whole story. How could I explain the weight of command, the burden of watching young men die under my orders? How could I describe the sound a human body makes when it's hit by a .30 caliber machine gun bullet, or the way the jungle smelled after a night of killing? I went on the war bond tour as ordered, speaking to crowds across America about the importance of supporting our boys overseas. I told them about Marine courage and American determination and the righteousness of our cause. All of that was true, but it wasn't the complete truth. The complete truth was that war is chaos and terror and random death, dressed up in uniforms and flags and noble purposes. The complete truth was that heroes are just ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow manage to do their jobs. The complete truth was that we held that ridge not for grand strategy or patriotic ideals, but for each other. For Private Powell and his machine gun. For Corporal Evanson and his radio. For 36 other Marines who were just as scared as I was, but who stayed at their posts because that's what Marines do. In February 1945, I returned to combat as an enlisted man, serving with the 27th Marines during the battle for Iwo Jima. On February 19th, just 5 days after the invasion began, I was killed by a Japanese mortar round while leading my men forward against an enemy strongpoint. I never got to see the end of the war, never got to go home to the wife I had married during my leave, never got to raise the children we had planned. But I did get to see something perhaps more important. I got to see what Americans could accomplish when their backs were against the wall and everything they held dear was at stake. The battle for Guadalcanal lasted 6 months and cost both sides tens of thousands of casualties. Henderson Field changed hands several times, but in the end, it remained in American control. The Japanese, realizing that they could not sustain their forces so far from their home bases, began a gradual withdrawal that would continue for the rest of the war. Historians now call Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when American forces stopped retreating and began the long push toward Tokyo. They're probably right, though at the time it just felt like another day in hell. What I remember most clearly is not the strategic importance of what we did, but the faces of the Marines who did it. Powell with his nervous habit of checking his ammunition. Evanson with his steady hands on the radio. 36 other young Americans who answered their country's call and paid whatever price was asked of them. They were the real heroes of Guadalcanal, not the guy who got the medal. They held the line when the line had to be held, fought the fight when the fight had to be fought, and died when dying was what their country needed. In the end, that's all any of us can do. We show up, we do our jobs, and we trust that somewhere, somehow, it all means something. The ridge we held that night is still there, covered now with jungle growth and the passage of time. Tourists occasionally visit, following guides who point out the remains of foxholes and gun emplacements. They take pictures and buy souvenirs and try to imagine what it must have been like. They can't, of course. Nobody can who wasn't there. But maybe that's for the best. Some stories are too heavy for civilian shoulders, too dark for peaceful minds to bear. All I know is that for one night in October 1942, 38 Marines stood between civilization and chaos, between freedom and tyranny, between hope and despair. We stood, and we held, and because we held, the world changed. That's enough. That has to be enough.